Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, welcome back to my greenhouse. My name is Joe. If you need a summary of how to successfully grow cacti, what is it that they really need, what is it that they really like, versus what they dislike, what they do not need, what kills them, well, I've tried to put together the key points, also based on my own experiences of many years of growing these wonderful plants, and I've put together a sort of a cactus video guide, the ultimate cactus video growing guide for you. A summary that hopefully will help you also grow your cacti successfully. So I'd like to take a look with yourselves at some of the key requirements for growing cacti. So what are the requirements cacti have for their growing locations? Temperature, light, etc. What's the most suitable substrate or cactus soil? Which pots or growing vessels do they need? How and when to best water cacti? And what about feeding, fertilizing? But also, what are their requirements for winter dormancy? In this one-stop shop summary video, I'd like to take you through these key requirements. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, no matter whether you are a sort of a novice with just a few cacti, having started off relatively recently with the hobby, whether even before that you might be someone who's thinking of starting to grow cacti, or whether you're already a quite experienced, seasoned grower and you've got a whole collection of cacti of your own. It doesn't really matter. I hope that there are enough points in this video that might be of interest to yourselves. Because as I said in the intro, we're going to be looking at the key requirements that cacti have to keeping them happy. Now, some of you will ask, how actually do you know that they are happy? Well, I guess they'll tell you indirectly. They will look healthy, they will have wonderful spines, and if you're lucky and the cacti are old and mature enough to do so, they'll even show their wonderful, beautiful blooms to you. And by the way, what actually is old enough when we talk about cacti and their blooming age? Well, that of course depends a lot on the species, the type of cactus. Some of them, like Rebutias, Notocacti, they will actually already flower at the tender age of maybe 2 or 3 years. Other cacti might take decades until they are ready to show their flowers. So, if you've got some of those in your collection, you'd be probably growing the cactus primarily for its wonderful looks, for the spines, the shapes, the sizes, and even the color, the unusual color that some of the cacti have on their outer skin, on the epidermis. Cacti are simply fascinating and beautiful plants that are worth growing, no matter what type of growing location you can offer. There are some minimum requirements. Actually, I'm often asked, can you grow any type of cactus? Are all cacti suitable for growing in a hobby collection? Well, in principle, yes. However, of course, there are some very specialist type of species that are quite difficult to grow. They require very special growing conditions. They're not normally the type of cacti that you would find, say, in a supermarket or a plant center. But as I say, those are quite rare, and they are specialist type of cacti that we're not going to be talking about in this video. We are going to be focusing on the vast majority of cacti, and those are actually relatively easy to grow if we keep a couple of basic requirements that they have firmly in our mind. In this video, I'm going to be distinguishing between so-called desert cacti and so-called jungle cacti. The so-called desert cacti, of course, they are the majority of cacti that we can buy and grow. They're cacti that, of course, as the name says, originally come from habitats in deserts, in dry, arid, half deserts and full deserts. They're the typical prickly, spiny cacti that we will always think of first, I think, when we think of cacti. Some examples would be the barrel cacti, the desert barrel cacti, the golden barrel cactus, the saguaros, fishhook cacti, and so on. In contrast, the so-called jungle cacti are cacti that have long leaf-like stems. They're mainly epiphytic cacti, so they grow on other plants, on trees, a bit like orchids, and they are cacti that grow in jungle, half-jungle, subtropical type of environments, so a quite different environment to where our desert cacti normally come from. Some examples would be the fishbone cactus or the Christmas or Thanksgiving cacti. Now, the key requirements we're going to be looking at in this video are the growing location, so how much light and which temperatures are ideal, the most suitable substrate or soil type, which pots or growing vessels they need, how and when best to water cacti, how and when to fertilize and feed them with nutrients, and what are their main winter dormancy requirements. And for each of these parameters, we're going to take a look at key points around what they like versus what they dislike. So let's start off with the desert cacti. Desert cacti love a nice sunny spot with good and extended light exposure, but always beware that you don't burn your cactus from too much and too hot direct sunlight. I would say a minimum of 3 to 4 hours direct or indirect sunshine, and the rest of the day is okay to be in a sort of a part shade location for the rest of the day. If you're growing your cacti indoors on a windowsill, let's say, ideally you'd put them on a south-facing window or on an east or west-facing window, but then it's also quite advantageous if you offer them some additional lighting. And the south-facing window, of course, assumes you're living on the northern hemisphere. If it's the southern hemisphere you're living on, well, then obviously a north-facing window would be the ideal location. A good air movement, regular fresh air, is something cacti love. And ideally, the temperatures that you grow them in would be ranging between 15 and 35 degrees centigrade, which is about 60 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And they quite like a sort of a medium air humidity, not too dry, but also not too humid. Now, a really important point regarding exposure to sun. The highest risk of sunburning your cacti is in the spring, when the plants are moved usually from their winter locations, which are usually less sunny, and they're moved into the summer locations. Now, at that time, protect your plants initially for about maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks from the direct full sunshine, for example, with some shade netting. What cacti really dislike is standing in shade only, in darkness, no sunlight. The result will be that your cacti will start to thin. That's a feature called etiolation. They'll thin, they'll become unhealthy, and they'll also start to become prey to a lot of pests much more easily. Equally, they really dislike a lack of air circulation if there's constant hot or constant cold temperatures that they're standing in. Damp, high humidity, or very dry, low humidity, as I've said, is something that cacti equally dislike. Now, when it comes to the required substrate or soil type, cacti love well-draining, sandy, gritty cactus substrate, and ideally it would be low on peat and organic components. I have not more than 20% in my cactus growing soil, 20% that is of organic components. A nice rule of thumb is when you squeeze the cactus soil that you use in your hand and you open your hand, the soil should crumble apart rather than stay together as a compact clump. Another great rule of thumb I find is that when you water your cacti, the water really should be draining through the substrate and out of the pot in less than a minute. In order to help achieve a good drainage and also, importantly, a good re-wettability, you can add pumice, perlite, lava sand, quartz sand. These are all good mineral ingredients to add to your cactus soil mix. A word of warning around a lot of the commercial cacti and potting soil mixes that are around. They usually contain a lot of peat, and that holds moisture much longer than desirable. So what I can recommend is, if you have purchased plants, cacti in these commercial potting mixes, these peat-rich cactus soils, I would recommend repotting them into a proper well-draining cactus soil mix as soon as you can. Now, what type of pots or growing vessels do you repot them or pot them into? Well, well-draining pots or containers, those are ideal. Avoid standing water in these containers. Because a lot of cacti have quite shallow root networks, they quite like relatively shallow so-called half pots or trays. There are cacti, however, that have deep tuberous and tap roots. Those will require normal or deeper pots. When you choose pots for your cacti, don't oversize them. It's usually sufficient to have about a 2 centimeter or 1 inch gap between the cactus and the side of the pot. And very importantly, after you've repotted cacti, always wait at least 1, better even 2 weeks with watering. And that is really to minimize the risk of root rot and infections via the roots that were damaged possibly during the repotting. Also, I personally prefer to repot my cacti towards the end of the winter dormancy period. So in February, March, when plants are dormant anyway, the roots are dry, and that results usually in less damages to the roots and also much less of a root risk. And when I then, a few weeks later, as the growth season starts, I start to water for the first time, the cacti really get going in their new substrate, in their new pots. On the side of negatives, pots and vessels, growing containers that do not have drainage holes, they are simply a no-go, because they will result almost certainly in root rot and loss of your plants. Also, as I said earlier, avoid using too large pots, and that's mainly because the soil will remain moist and wet much longer in a large pot than it will in a smaller pot. And so your plants might not be able to absorb all that moisture, and again, the risk of root rot is much higher. Regarding the type of pots you can use for your cacti and other succulent plants, I've got 1 or 2 videos that actually deep dive into this topic, the types of pots, but also a video that describes how and when I actually pot and repot my cacti. When it comes to watering, well, water only after the soil of your cactus pot has dried out after the previous watering. So avoid constant wet and moist soil. So always wait until the substrate has dried before you start watering again. But when you water during the warmer spring and summer growth period, well, then I recommend, properly watering, sufficiently watering. Don't hold back. Just really water your plants properly when you do so, but allow the substrate to properly dry after that. Now, although it's not a must, but ideally, if you can use rainwater or tap water that has been left in a bucket overnight, that would be ideal. Now, if there's one key takeaway from this video, I'd like you to remember, please, that overwatering is truly the most common killer for our cacti. So constantly watering them without, as I said earlier, waiting for the substrate to have dried out in between the waterings. When it comes to the type or the quality of the water, the pH range that cacti like most is between 5.5 and 6.5, so a slightly acidic. However, avoid strongly acidic or strongly alkaline water. I've got a lot more information, a lot more details on watering cacti in a dedicated video that I put together that focuses on watering cacti. You might want to check it out on my channel. Cacti also need nutrients, but because they're quite adapted to low nutrient environments, they should be fertilized quite lightly. So to give you an example, I fertilize my cactus collection maximum 3, in the best of years, 4 times per growing season. I recommend you use a balanced low nitrogen cactus fertilizer. They usually have a NPK ratio of 277 or 176. So a cactus fertilizer, one that also includes chemical trace elements that are so important for the health of your cacti. With cacti, there is a relatively high risk of overfeeding. And that's because a lot of products that you can buy, also dedicated cactus fertilizers, but also some expert authors, I'll call them, they recommend fertilizing cacti every week or every 2 weeks. Now, that is not what I would recommend. I think that the results would be very unhealthy, very unnatural, and bloated looking plants. So initially your cacti might start to grow really well and really fast, but it won't take long before they actually start to rip open. They, as I say, bloat. They become very prone to disease, and they will actually flower less or not at all. So apply fertilizers, but apply them sparingly. If you'd like to dive into fertilizing cacti a bit deeper, then I recommend you watch my dedicated video on this topic. You can find it on my channel, of course. Something often overlooked when growing cacti is that they do actually benefit strongly from getting a winter dormancy. So during the winter months, typically from October to February or March, that's on the northern hemisphere, most cacti require a rest or dormancy. And that would be providing them with a light location, so some good light exposure, but in a relatively cool room of around 7 to 10 degrees centigrade, so 45 to 50 degree Fahrenheit roughly. During the winter dormancy, keep the substrate dry, stop watering if you can, or strongly reduce your watering to perhaps maximum once a month, where you give the cactus a few drops of water if it has actually shriveled a lot. But most cacti will shrivel. They will shrivel a little bit, but that's not unusual and that's not dangerous. Really important during winter dormancy, if you can provide good air circulation and, say, a medium level of humidity, somewhere between 40 to 60% relative humidity, that really helps the health of your cacti and helps avoid a lot of pests that they could be otherwise picking up. Unless your cacti are frost-hardy cactus species, beware. Cacti are very sensitive to cold temperatures, definitely very sensitive to frost. So avoid frost and try and make sure that the ambient temperatures of around your collection don't drop below 4 degrees centigrade or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. As I've said before, avoid or minimize watering, avoid wet substrate. That really is to avoid your plants dying off from root rot. During the winter dormancy, absolutely do not fertilize. Do not feed nutrients in the winter. Your plants are in rest during these winter months. Your plants would not be able to use any nutrients at this time of the year anyway. And now let's take a look at the so-called jungle cacti. Now, when it comes to the best growing locations for the so-called jungle cacti, a good growing location would be in the half shade. For example, in the shade or half shade of a tree in a garden. 1 to 2 hours of sunshine in the morning or in the afternoon is quite beneficial to the plants, but also make sure that you bring your plants in from an outside location before the first frosts hit fall. If you're growing your cacti, your jungle cacti indoors, an east or a west facing windowsill would be perfect. And they normally enjoy the room temperatures that we keep in our homes. However, do provide good or at least moderate air movement and circulation, and the temperatures ideally during the daytime would be in a range between 20 to 25 degrees centigrade, so 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or at night around 15 degrees centigrade, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And like with the desert cacti, like mentioned before, the highest risk of sunburning our jungle cacti would also be in the spring, as we move them often from the darker winter months, but also darker winter locations, into the much more intense sun in spring. So protect your plants from the full direct sunlight with some shade netting if you can. The points to avoid, pretty much the opposite to what I've just been going through with you. So avoid strong direct sunlight, avoid hot and dry or cold and damp stagnating air, and if you're growing your cacti indoors, well, a hot south-facing windowsill would not be so ideal for them. Pretty much all species of jungle cacti, they really like a pretty rich soil, but with excellent drainage. So as an example of such a soil, I've put down here a mix of 1 part potting soil, 1 part peat, 1 part perlite, and 1 part bark chippings or orchid mix. That's an excellent, pretty well draining substrate for these epiphytic cacti, so cacti that grow on trees in their natural habitat. So just as a reminder, do not use standard sandy and mineral-rich cactus soil mixes for these epiphytic cacti. Don't use the same soil that you'd be using for your desert cacti, because they would likely dry out and they would relatively quickly die off from the lack of humidity. What's beautiful about these so-called jungle cacti is they can also be grown. In fact, they really prefer being grown in hanging pots or lined hanging baskets. And that, of course, is because naturally they are epiphytic, so growing on plants. In my experience, jungle cacti do not really grow well in growing beds in the ground or in large and poorly draining vessels. So I grow all of mine in hanging baskets or hanging pots. Now there's a difference to the desert cacti when it comes to watering as well. With the jungle cacti, soil should only dry out slightly, never completely in between the waterings. And so jungle cacti do require always some light moisture and good humidity. You can mist or spray the plants when you've got a spell of dry weather, or if they're located and hanging in quite dry rooms inside. What they love is having the pots or plants soaked from time to time. So, as I've said, jungle cacti really do not appreciate completely dry conditions. And in fact, these are cacti that can be killed both by over but also underwatering. And again, if you can use rainwater to water these plants, because they really don't respond well to alkaline or chlorinated, strongly chlorinated tap water. Again, with fertilizing, you can fertilize your jungle cacti with a balanced fertilizer. A NPK ratio of 20-20-20 is quite common for these type of fertilizers. And here a frequency of about every 3 to 4 weeks is quite beneficial. I would use, though, around about a third or a quarter of the recommended dosage. So again, relatively light fertilizing, but in this case, slightly more frequent than with desert cacti. In any case, though, avoid overfeeding plants. They will turn yellow, and you could have salts actually crystallizing on the surface of the soil mix if too much nutrients have been provided. And lastly, jungle cacti also benefit from a winter dormancy. That will also very often be during the winter months. Keep them in a bright, also partly sunny location with temperatures at least 10 degrees, 12 degrees centigrade. That's 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Reduce the watering, but don't completely stop with watering. During the winter months, though, you really need to avoid frosts at all circumstances. All the epiphytic cacti, because they come from subtropical type of environments, they really are very sensitive to cold temperatures. So, as I've said before, try not to drop temperatures below 10 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Also, avoid very dark or very dry locations during the winter months. And as I've said, don't fertilize, just stop fertilizing over the winter dormancy period. There's two more important topics that I'd like to briefly mention. There's not enough time in this video to go into a huge amount of detail, but one of them is propagation of cacti, and whether that's via pups from mother plants or it's propagation via cuttings like these opuntia cuttings, or propagation via grafting, or propagation via seeds. There are several ways that cacti can be propagated, and that's going to be featured in a separate video. Equally important, and not really enough time to fully cover in this video, is the topic of pests that cacti can suffer from. So one really important point to make up front is that cacti can, of course, catch pests. They can catch diseases through external sources to your collection. But first and foremost, it's mainly stressed plants, stressed cacti that are vulnerable, that are really at risk of being infected, of becoming prey to various types of pests, including fungi and bacteria. So healthy cacti that are stressed as little as possible, they really are also quite fit to fight off external pests and external threats. So it's really important to realize that the healthier your plants are, the less at risk they are, the less likely they will actually be attacked by pests, whether that's insects, fungi, or bacteria. Now, of course, there's never a 100% guarantee, and also healthy plants can be attacked, no doubt about that. But first and foremost, I think a proactive, protective type of approach is actually quite a healthy one. Pun intended. I've mentioned many times in the sections before that root rot is a huge risk to cacti. And usually we see the first signs of root rot when it's far too late to actually rescue a plant. It'll be the central axis that turns brown or soft and mushy, or it'll be the base of the plant that does the same. And before you know it, you slightly pull on the plant and it comes off entirely, and the inside of the plant can already be completely eaten up by the bacteria and the viral infection that's been lingering inside for quite some time, invisible to us from the outside. Probably the next most common risk to our plants are mealybugs, and I'm going to start with the nastier of the two versions, those that we can hardly see because they actually are hiding inside the substrate, inside the pots of our plants, and they are the root mealybugs that we can immediately detect when we take a closer look at the roots at the inside of the substrate, and we detect this powdery white substance, and those are the root mealybugs already at work. Best to immediately treat, so remove all the substrate carefully and treat the roots with a pesticide against root mealybugs. Then there's the standard mealybugs, if you like. They're really quite common and they're quite easy to detect. There are these white fluffy features on the outside of our plants sticking on the epidermis. They can be at least washed off relatively easily, or also what you can do is use rubbing alcohol to actually remove these mealybugs directly from the plants. You've got to repeat that treatment, though, at least 2 or 3 times after that first treatment, because they have laid their eggs and they've got more generations coming. Also nasty are red spider mites. They're tiny. You can barely see them with the naked eye. And usually what you see is when it's already too late, the damage has been done. Plants that were infected by spider mites get this silvery white sort of coating like these plants. Usually really hard to proactively or detect early. These are pests that typically attack our plants when the air is very dry, unlike mealybugs, which tend to really multiply when there is a high air humidity around our plants. And there's a few more like aphids and others that occur but are not quite that common with cacti. Plus they can be seen with the naked eye. Again, they can be detected early and removed relatively early. I also use a systemic pesticide once, maximum twice a growing season. And a systemic pesticide is one that is actually taken on by the plant. It incorporates the active ingredients into the cells of the plant and actually kills off the pests when they start attacking the plant and start ingesting the cellular fluids. Now folks, I hope that there was something useful in this video for you. The summary of the key growing requirements for cacti to successfully grow and have happy cacti in your collection. I'd also like to encourage you to explore on my channel for all the videos that I've put out there that go into quite some additional information and depth on all of these topics that we've covered today. Now, if you enjoyed the video, if you found it useful, informative, then it'd be great if you actually clicked a like. If you would like to leave a comment, please do so. I always try and come back and answer all of my comments as soon as I can. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, I'd be delighted if you did. Those of you, of course, who are already subscribed to this channel, who are a part of this magnificent community, thank you so much. A very warm and big thank you for all your support and ongoing engagements. So, thanks very much for joining today. Stay safe, and as always, happy growing.